So we've just heard about the TLM from Jan, we've heard about vegetation from Todd and Simon, and and Fiona's, and Jason, sorry, and Fiona's given us a lovely insight into the assessments that you're doing out there with RMAC and the rangers. Got to be a burning question. Here we go.
Brenton Zampatti from CSIRO. Jace, from your lovely graphs, your many lovely graphs, one of the takeaways I had was that kangaroos make a bigger difference to understory vegetation than floods or regulator operation or water management. Is that the case?
Yeah, but in a bad way. So, yeah, I mean that year, the 2020. I mean, it was a dry year. There'd been an explosion in kangaroo numbers. I think it was about 10 times the sort of target that parks have for roo numbers. I think Simon, you're here, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. I think the target is about 8 or 10 roos per square kilometre, and I think there were around about 100 roos per square kilometre. So we're just eating everything in sight. But it also does show that the floodplain understory has quite a remarkable capacity to recover. It has a very long-lived seed bank, so there's a lot of seed in the soil. It's persistent. It hedges its bets, so some of the not all of the seed germinates when it has the opportunity to germinate. Some of it sits in the seed bank dormant, so that if you get a false start one year, so the plants come up, they're not able to reproduce. There's still some seed in the seed bank for subsequent years. It does quite have a remarkable capacity to respond, although I think at the moment there's going to be a lot of sclerolina in that seed bank, just judging by what's on the floodplain at the moment, as you'll see tomorrow.
Thank you.
I'll just add to that if I can. So we've got those little grazing exclosures over a number of sites at the floodplain now. Some of them have been in place since 2005. There's a very site-specific response to grazing pressure. At some of those sites where the exclosures are, there's no visible or discernible difference between biomass or species inside and outside of the exclosures. Other sites, there's a distinctly different vegetation community, so completely different species are present. So the palatable ones are all smashed on the outside. And there are other sites where there's minor differences in biomass. You can definitely see it, but the plants are still there. And then there are other sites like that last photo at Lake Litra where it's basically bare soil outside and knee-high on the inside. So very site-specific and very inter-year variable.
Yeah, to back up what Todd says, I mean, the eastern part of the floodplain, Gum Flat, doesn't seem to get the grazing pressure that, say, Litra does or Coppermine. Jan showed me photos of Coppermine after the regulator, and there was moira grass, and it looked green, it looked amazing. I went up there sort of about a month or 2 months after the regulator operation, and it was a moonscape. Things get eaten really quickly and they change really quickly.
There's some variability too, depending on the broader climate as well. I mean, obviously, if we're delivering water within a broadly dry landscape, you do attract, there's a lot to attract a lot of things to the floodplain, so that can make a big difference too. But there's certainly been a comprehensive effort by national parks to manage total grazing pressure over the last, over recent years. So, yeah.
Grace, and then did I have one back here as well? Chris, in a minute? Yep.
I want to know about vegetation as well, sorry. Are there particular species or types of species or functional groups, Jason, that aren't in the landscape that you expect should be there? And if so, is it due to stock grazing or drought? Or do we just simply not know that necessarily?
We probably don't know it. Probably the place to look for that, and it's something I haven't given a hell of a lot of thought to, which has probably been a bit negligent of myself, but I think if we went and looked at the big survey that was done in the, I think you were, Tony, were you an editor of that one, or was it? No, it was the one that the surveys that Jane Roberts and Francis O'Malley did across the floodplain. I mean, they did some big cataloguing exercises there, and they picked up a lot of stuff that I don't find because of the different surveying techniques. I mean, I've got a lot of smaller quadrats because I want to look at change through time. They did a one-off cataloguing survey, so they had a larger number of, so they had a smaller number of large quadrats and probably surveyed more area than I do. So they'd probably pick up more species. So you would probably look at that and see what they have there, because that was also after a fairly wet period that they did that work. Look there and see what's missing. That's something that potentially I could definitely do it. I've got that report. That's a good question, and probably off the top of my head I can't answer it. I'll probably have to do a little bit more digging to be able to find that one out.
Chris Lill, Riverland Field Naturalist and member of the Eremophila Study Group, and my question is very, very similar. What sort of evidence do you have that any particular vegetation has gone extinct as a result of either grazing because of a grazing pressure from roos, or also because of the floodplain not getting enough water? I mean, there's a lot of talk about very obvious trees, but there's a lot of vegetation out there.
Yeah, again, a good question, and we don't really know. There's just not the evidence prior to the millennium drought. There's just been a few sporadic studies. When you're saying you like eremophilas, you'll be quite pleased up there at the moment. There's a couple of species that are of eremophila up there. The large one, the tree, the Eremophila bignoniflora, there are a lot of seedlings on Chowilla at the moment for Eremophila bignoniflora. There are they seem to disperse very well, because I'm finding them in areas where there are no adult trees, like for sort of kilometres. There's also a couple of understory eremophilas that I've seen up there recently that I've never seen before. So it's looking quite good.
A question for Fiona. Really enjoyed hearing about the swan breeding event, but is there a particular memory or moment that you really cherish being out at Chowilla on the floodplain with your community?
Yeah, with the swans. Because my grandfather, he never ever went into a butcher shop. Everything he hunted from the land, shoot swans or set traps for rabbits or whatever, so that's why they're culturally significant. Swans and Naartje is like a totem, and that's where, it's not my Naartje, but it's the Nurrinjeri mob, it's their totem, the swans, so that's why we protect them as well.
Yeah, it was pretty awesome, wasn't it, to at the AWA to identify that breeding event was happening, and Fiona ploughing out there to check whether there were eggs in the nest, and then for us to be able to say to TLM, hey, we need to top this watering site up rather than let it dry out. And working with parks and talking about fox control, but really special time to be able to add that water and to be able to have footage of the swans successfully breeding. So yeah, pretty special.
Peter Freeman from Mertho. I'd like to ask Jason, are you worried about the terrific extent of Ngurra burr after the flood, or with increased pumping or floods, will the perennial species end up taking over from Ngurra burr?
I'm worried about Ngurra burr. It's a menace. And the thing about Ngurra burr, because it germinates so quickly and it grows so quickly, it smothers everything else. One thing about Ngurra burr, though, it's and this is maybe a good or a bad thing. It's one of the main hosts for golden dodder. You often see dodder and Ngurra burr. You see the dodder smothering it, but I was at a wetland yesterday, and I normally don't see dodder sort of infesting native species too much, and it was yes, smothering of quite a few of the native species as well, which was somewhat of a concern. But I'm not sure what you can do about Ngurra bird. That's the other thing. I mean, I'd love to be able to provide a solution to Ngurra bird that doesn't involve spraying. It's really about the only thing you can do for infestations at that scale, and it's on a watercourse. Unless we need an army of volunteers to go out there and pull it up before it sets seed.
It'd be almost an impossible job, and I wonder whether the dodder will eventually get it under control.
Oh, probably not. There's too much of it.
Chris Badley from TLM Community Advisory Panel. For Jan, perhaps, I'd be interested in a snapshot of the cycle of operations on the regulator, why you decide to open the gates and to close them, and whether you can direct water to specific parts of the floodplain.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. So in terms of the big floodplain regulator at the bottom of Chowilla Creek, I guess that the functioning of that, the operation of that, we've sort of described variously. Todd sort of described some of the inputs to deciding when we're going to operate that. Looking at what the condition monitoring is indicating. And I guess operation of that regulator, it's not just a course on or off, it can be operated to different scales. So depending on the sort of objectives that we're setting, but also the sort of year that we've got, the volumes of water that are available, but also the operation of the regulator is very much linked to the flows in the river. So we won't undertake a large-scale operation of the regulator under very low flows in the river. We need, 35,000, 45,000 in order to target a really high-level operation of the regulator. And that's because it's not just about blocking off flows down Chowilla Creek to raise water levels behind it and to push that water out onto the floodplain. It's about raising water levels but also maintaining that flowing anabranch and trying to maintain to the degree that we can the velocity or the good velocities within that anabranch. So there's a link between the flows in the river and the scale of operation that we might undertake in a year. There's a link to the monitoring evidence and what it's telling us about the need for water on the floodplain. There are a range of other ancillary structures and they're operated in concert with the big regulator, and that's about maximising the inundation, but it's also about making sure that we maintain... Sorry, Jason, I keep nearly punching you. It's about maintaining those flowing conditions, and that's about water quality as well as flow velocities. We do have structures on some of the wetland areas. So, for example, on Hancock Creek, there's a regulating structure. We could and have on an occasion withheld water. So you use the regulator to push the water out, fill Lake Limbra, but then withhold the water by closing off the regulating structure. That is, an option in the toolkit. Ideally, I think with floodplain operations, you want to get water out there, but you also want to drag those nutrients and that carbon back into the creek and into the river, because that's what's supporting, a whole range of ecological processes, the food web. So, those decisions to withhold water might be around trying to extend the period of inundation in that lake, because there might be a bird breeding event, or we might want to hold water a bit longer because, we're concerned about losing some tadpole breeding, etc. But our default is to raise water levels, get water across the floodplain as happens in a natural flood, and then have that floodplain shed that water back into the creek with all the goodies in it. So there are, in terms of... So far, we've operated at, very small testing in the first event, but, still got water out over a couple of thousand hectares. And then the following year, quite dry conditions, but it was still deemed worthwhile to just do an in-channel rise sort of event, so raising water levels not to spread out across the floodplain, but to vary water levels within the channel. Following that, in 2016, good flows in the river. This is our chance to really test it as high as we can, and we did a 3.5 metre raise of water levels at the regulator with a significant raising of Lock 6 at the same time. And subsequent to that, we've done a couple of lower level regulator operations. But again, it very much depends on what the flow profile is in the river, as well as the condition on the floodplain and the availability of environmental water. Sorry, Chris, that was a big, long...
Thanks, Tony. Judy Good. Todd, you mentioned that salt in the soil profile is one of the big challenges. To what extent has salt been monitored? Do you have a good understanding of how much salt's mobilised during weir raisings, during the regulator operation, as opposed to during floods? Is it important that you do know?
It's a really good question. We do know part of the answer to that question. So there is in-stream salinity monitoring that can be used to work out how many tonnes of salt went down through the system. But in terms of what's been stored in the unsaturated zone, in the soil profile where the trees have got their roots, the sampling that we have, some of that goes back to about 2009. I think some of those sites were initially established. We've managed delivery of water, so pumping, regulator operations. You don't see a lot of flushing of salt. You tend to see the salt move down the soil profile, mostly because the infiltration isn't very far. Like, you tend to see the salt go down. The wet zone only goes down about 1 metre to maybe 1.5 metres, and the salt that's stored in that top part of the profile goes down and stays there. And so we see these, what we call a salinity wedge, where you look at the vertical profile and the line goes up, and then it gets to 1.5 metres and it just shoots out to the right to extreme salinity levels. And that's where you get those photos where you had the crystallisation. The salts have become so concentrated, they're actually precipitating out of solution and forming crystals in the soil profile. In some sites, post the 22-23 flood, the flood inundation was actually long enough and the soil type was conducive to it, that there was a near total flushing of salt out of the soil profile in some sites, but not in a lot of sites. Does that answer your question? Yep.
There's a lot of salt stored in that floodplain.
Yeah.
I guess your point about the water quality monitoring is important as well, or that monitoring kind of indicating that, while salt's been mobilised, we've got, I guess, another reason for linking the scale of our operations to flows in the river is considering those sort of downstream impacts. So ideally we are mobilising salt and shifting it off out of the system, but you certainly don't want to be doing that when you've got low flows. So.
Wow, almost. Peter, you got the last question, then we're going to have a break.
Yeah, Peter Bird, no relation to Nagura, Bathurst or Californian. Todd, while we're on the subject of monitoring the movement of salts, have you noticed any chemical intrusion from flooding getting brought downstream, like phosphates and things like that?
Not in the monitoring that I do. SA Water do weekly and fortnightly sampling, and you'd be able to investigate that data to look for whatever sort of pollutants you're interested in, whether that's excess nutrients or fertilisers or pesticides and the like. One of the big things we did see in the data, though, is fluorescence of iron oxides at the soil surface. So the groundwater was pushed right up to the soil surface and brings a lot of iron oxide with it, and when that hit an oxygenated surface, that precipitated out. And so anybody that was out on the floodplain in the early weeks or months after the flood would have seen red scalding on top of the soil profile, and that's iron oxide precipitating out. There is some concern that could bring sulphitic material with it to the surface as well, so acid sulphate soils. We've done a fair bit of testing around Chowilla Pike and Catarapco associated with that. There are a few areas that are of additional concern, and that is it's potentially a long-term concern with weir pool manipulation of raising and lowering weir pools, of drying sediments and drying the saturated, what is now is the saturated zone where the groundwater is. As you lower weir pools, the groundwater and the surface water will equilibrate really quickly. They go up and down together very, very, very quickly. And so if you've got an area that's been wet for since the 1920s, and it's had an accumulation of sulphate and sulphur materials in it, and then you rapidly dry it, you could turn that material into acid sulphate soils, and so it's something that we need to keep in mind as we go forward. The flip side of that is the salt accumulation that we see in the floodplain is because of the height of the weirs. So we brought the groundwater up, estimated because groundwater and surface waters equilibrate, and surface water levels about 3 metres higher than it was pre-regulation. Groundwater levels are about 3 metres higher than it was pre-regulation. And so we're seeing a lot of evaporation of that groundwater, and it leaves the salt behind in the soil profile. Unless you have really regular flooding, you can't get rid of it. And there's a tipping point that once you go past a certain amount of salt in the soil profile, the soil goes to what we call being sodic, and you no longer get infiltration of water. The soil becomes basically impermeable, and you'll never, once that happens, you'll never wash that salt out of the soil profile. And so there's a long-term challenge for how to manage trying to reduce that rate of salt accumulation, because it's every day. There's tons of salt accumulating in the soil profile every day. And so we'll get to a point where the areas that you can't improve by flooding will continue to grow as that salt load continues to accumulate. So it's the next major challenge, is working out how to deal with that.
Please thank Fiona, Jan, Jason and Todd.